Hello, my name is Richard Strong. I used to be with the Center for Sustainable Building Research, even though it says there should be retired, although they keep taking you back all the time, want you to do more work for nothing. But so anyway, so since Peter and I developed these guidelines, we've been working at them almost 22 years, 2 years, not 22 years, 2 years. And I'll give you some of the thoughts behind it. These guidelines have actually gone through probably 5 presentations. When we first started, we got a group of LA and civil experts, what we consider really the forefront of the field, to kind of look at the conceptual, how we were approaching this. And we really got some positive feedback from both groups that we should pursue this directional approach. And you'll see it's a little bit different than the last one, and a little bit different than sites, and a little bit different than LEED. And then we met with them again about 6-7 months later, and we said these are the kind of guidelines we're looking at, and these are the kind of metrics we're trying to set. And again, we got a really good response from that, so we decided to go ahead. We started writing the guidelines. We presented them to general groups, and they were fairly positive. They seemed that it was going on. And then we sent it out to all the agencies, literally the guidelines. And we got some feedback on that and specific points, and we changed it. And then we went back to the experts again and say, this is these are finalized metrics, these is where we want to go. And again, we got pretty good feedback from that. So then we finished the guidelines. And this is the result of that work. So it's taken us some time, but I did really well. So this is the background of B3 revision and timeline. Approach the intent of site water guidelines, which I think the intent is really important, and then we'll go through the specific guidelines. The good news, there used to be 14 guidelines, now there's only 5. The bad news, the 5 have a lot of stuff in them. So it's not more, but it's not significantly less either. So the central theme of the whole approach of this is designing within the systems that sustain us. We know there's ecological systems out there that sustain our being, our lifestyles, our regulatory systems and things like that. Unless we can design within those systems, we will not be doing sustainable design, and we probably won't be here very long, right? If we continually degrade the systems that sustain us, then what's the end point there? What's the end point? So this is really taking an ecological approach to design and trying to enhance the systems that have been degraded in the past, and probably restore if possible. So that's kind of what you can see. The intents behind the change is just what I mentioned, and we're looking at site and water connections, water quality, soil, vegetation, animal habitat. Those things really are the systems that sustain our life here on Earth. And then we'll use the tools and meeting the new guidelines, how we go about do that, and then document it for compliance. So originally, this was the original kind of symbol when we started in 1995, the first guidelines. We thought the feedback, it would go pre-design, design, construction, occupancy, and then getting feedback as we rolled out the system. And I think within Site and Water, we have feedback. And part of the feedback is because they're static guidelines, it's true, everything we had in there was true for all the sites. And as a result, some sites really had difficulty making it, some of those water guidelines and things, vegetation. And other sites, they were just, it was like falling down. It wasn't any problem. So it was strange, since every site in Minnesota is very different. Why would you have one guideline that would say all sites have to be the same? So we got that planning back and stuff like that. And there were specific guidelines that we ended up changing. Peter and I changed as we went along because it just wasn't working. So we started getting that feedback over the last 10 years or 20 years on that too. It works at different scales. And certainly we will talk about things that are outside the project, but the project will have impact on that. So even though there's a project scale, there's a firm scale, and there's a B3 program scale, you could say there's a site scale, there's a kind of a district scale, and there might be a regional scale. Because ecologically, all things are tied together, aren't they? So you're sitting within that network of ecological functioning. So the project has a linchpin on that. Also, I think as we looked at this and after we did SB 2030, which is the energy program that sets definite kind of metrics, we thought we should create and evolve all the guidelines to more sustainable metrics. So on the diagram on the left, you can see that you have prescriptive on the bottom and performance on top. Prescriptive pretty much tells you how to do it. Performance tells you what the goal is. You figure out how to do it. And then we have relative kind of wishy-washy kind of metrics, and then you have absolute metrics. Say, not only do you have to hit a goal, this is the goal we want you to hit. So we are kind of migrating towards that upper right-hand corner. More performance-based, more absolute metrics. And I think as designers, I think that's easier for you to do, because once you know how to, once you can figure it out, then you can get there. There's also this one from Bill Reed that we constantly look at between B3 and practice. We don't want to compromise the two. We want to harmonize the two and hopefully bring it together. Believe it or not, we are always thinking about practice. We always think, well, how are they going to do this? Is there enough information? Can they get there from here? And so we do think about practice. And we've been offering educational courses. When we started SB 2030, we did a survey about how architectural firms would hit SB 2030. And we realized that really education is an important part of practice in order to build capacity to get there. And certainly this is one of the things. So again, attend to the guidelines, revise the performance requirements to reflect current state of the building industry. So we've been moving, the industry's been moving, and the practice has been moving. I think sustainability is much more accepted now than it was in 1995 when we first got out of the box. But I think we have a long ways to go. So we want to push. We don't want to be on the bleeding edge, but we certainly want to be on the, these guidelines won't be probably revised in 10 years. So if we take a middle point or low point in 10 years, we'll be way behind. So I think we're above average on this. If we're good looking above average kind of people. And so we want to make sure we're pushing the envelope, but not on the bleeding edge. So the timelines on this, you can see that we've done various revisions. The first one out of the box was 1.1, and we've revised it very to go along. But new construction after 2004 have to be B3. I don't think we even run into that anymore, that there was funding before 2004 anymore. And then the major renovations after 2009. So you can see how last year we did the materials and process. And then this year is indoor environmental quality and site and water. So version 3.1 will be required site and water and indoor environmental quality at the start of pre-design. The pre-design has to start after January 1st, 2019. Pre-design. Yep, you go into the previous one. So any pre-design start after January 1st, 2019 follows these new site and water standards and the new environmental quality standards. And I'm sure you're going to have some education on that.
Yep, and just a little bit of clarity. That's projects that are in pre-design and signed up in the tracking tool before January 1st, 2019. They need to be in our tracking program to be in the version 3.0. So if you've got a pre-design project right now, get it in so that we can note it as being part of the version 3.0.
So December 31st, there'll be a rush. Don't leave that open. Last time we did this, for some reason, about 15 projects just started that day before. So, yeah, it's hard to believe that so active.
Just so to avoid any confusion, we're doing this pre-design trigger for projects in 3.1. We're still going to use the schematic design start date trigger for SB 2030. So that still ratchets along at the kind of previous schedule. This is just taking into account those decisions that may be made in that pre-design phase, in the budgeting.
So we will do energy and atmosphere next year, and have you got any feeling what kind of changes are going to happen on that?
A lot of that is determining what renewables look like if you can do it similar to what we did here, where what a renewables look like if you can't do it on your building site, but you may have a campus opportunity to do that, what all of the process is around that.
Okay. So that will be coming out next year. Okay. What's interesting about, I had mentioned uniqueness of sites. So we're hoping these guidelines will be applicable to those uniqueness of the sites. Some things will apply, some things won't apply. But it is a kind of a list of requirements to determine whether they apply, and then if they do apply, then they'll be required under a certain metric. So watering guidelines are based on the characteristics of the site, the performance metrics that are tuned to that particular characteristics. So sites are optimized to their capability. Remember I talked before that some were being over-optimized and some were being less than optimized. So we wanted to make sure that everybody has to kind of be equally disadvantaged, is what I used to say in SB 2030. That because in SB 2030, we actually look at the particular building and set a standard for that particular building, not a standard across all buildings. So we're kind of doing the same kind of approach, at least on site. And reflects the diversity of the ecology and the hydrology of Minnesota. And it takes advantage of Minnesota's inventoried site conditions. It's surprising, we're one of the few states in the union that have very, very good site characteristics across the whole state. They've been inventoried and et cetera, and we'll look at some of those. And some will be asked to do more in certain categories, some will be asked to do less in certain categories. But in every case, there will be an improvement, ecological improvement in the site. That is the determining factor. So here's what I mentioned before. The good news is there was 14 before. The bad news is 14 before. The good news is there's only 5 now. But we're not asking you to do more. We're just asking you to do it differently this time. I think the old guidelines were just kind of old thinking and saying that every site should be so many trees, every site should have this much water capacity and stuff like that, so forth. And they were just kind of, they were too binding for the sites, but we know about sites. So you can kind of read that. Again, it's kind of ecological approach, restoring local soil and water quality, capable of supporting healthy biodiverse plants, animals, and human communities, which is essentially designing within the systems that sustain us, right? Yeah. And realizing how we're doing it now is not getting us there. The Millennium Assessment in 2000 kind of put a kind of stick in the sand, and then now we look 15 years later, almost every ecological system on Earth is degraded, except one. Can anybody mention the one that isn't? They're sitting in this room. Humans haven't degraded, but almost every other ecological system have degraded. So we've got to change, right? I'll let you read these. These are just the objectives that we are looking at. Looking at soils, both biotic and abiotic. Restoring the site's hydrological cycle. Reducing potable water and fossil fuel consumption. Reducing the amount of toxic materials. Enhancing biodiversity. And improving the outdoor air quality, environmental quality. So one thing that came up is site. So let's say usually site will be defined by the property lines in most cases. If you have property lines, or it can be defined about how much you're disturbing. So if you're on a large property, a campus or a corporate campus or whatever, or park, it can be, you can define your own property lines or your own site area by how much you're disturbing, and you can use that. You can stretch it out or how you want to do it in order to meet the guidelines. So under site, I think it's pretty flexible. And then let's say you're on a campus and it's a pretty concentrated campus and you need to have some habitat. And you don't want to put this bee habitat right next to the entrance of the building. You would like to move it over to a place where it might be more hospitable to it. And maybe you've done projects before, so you're building a bee habitat, you might want to put all your bee habitats together. Because the larger the environmental footprint or the ecological footprint, the better. A lot of small ones aren't as good as one big one. So we would actually encourage people to put their animal habitat, their and things like that together on campuses, rather than every project having these small habitats around them. Is that understandable? So there's some flexibility in site, and certainly if you have questions, Pat and Peter and I can talk about that to get the best ecological performance we can out of the site. Now, when you're dealing with an urban site, it's going to be difficult, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So as long as the land's owned by the same entity, we can do that. And even if the land's owned on either side of a right-of-way, we'll consider that the same entity. So even though a right-of-way might come through there, we'll work with that. And then satisfy the different secondary strategies defined necessary to meet the different guidelines. So here are site and water guidelines. The first one, we show the hardiness zones. Not every zone in Minnesota has the same ability to have certain plant materials. Peter and I teach a site and water course, which we talk about rainfall and stuff like that. And it's surprising that students don't know it doesn't rain the same amount across Minnesota, much less the United States, you know? So they think it rains, every place has the same amount of rain, you know? So it's until you come about thinking about that, then it really makes a difference. And of course, you know about it. What's really neat about Minnesota was this Marshner map. And the land survey from 1847 to 1907, essentially people walked Minnesota and by, I believe it's by square mile, they not only drew maps of the area, but they also made observations about water, ponds, rivers, trees, and basically they were looking for resources, but what this gives us is a really good map of exactly what was here, the natural vegetation before we decided to farm the entire state practically. So, and this comes down, you can get it almost down to a site level. Marshner never came to Minnesota, but he took all these land survey maps and made us a map that was like that. So you can start seeing the biomes there. There's a discussion whether there's 3 or 4 biomes in Minnesota. We certainly have a prairie biome, and you can see that in the yellow. And then we have a deciduous biome with the more of the rust color there. But you can see that within it's a transitional area. There is also prairie within the deciduous forest. And then we get up into the boreal forest, which is more in the blue and purples up there, and the bogs in the north. So you can see the diversity within our state. Why would we have one guideline that would be across the whole area? So the first part, S1, is about connection, how we make connections from our site to the surrounding environment. And one is plant connections. How do we start rebuilding this plant community that was so unique that was shown on the other slide to build some integrity in that and also some resiliency? How do we start reforming those plant communities? And here, greater either 25% of the project site, excluding building footprint, or 70% of the project site, excluding the building footprint and code minimum parking, should be planted using natural species. And we'll talk about how you determine those natural species. Okay? So either 25% of the site or 70% of the site. This is something we kind of went back and forth on. Now, how much of the site should be actually native species? Okay? And then if the project is within 10 miles of a scientific natural area, then the plant selection is to match that scientific natural area on your site. So these natural areas are pretty well defined throughout Minnesota, and the plant communities in those natural areas are pretty well defined. So in that case, we want you to match those plant communities almost perfectly in that 25% or 70%, okay? If the project is 1 mile from a scientific natural area, okay, what's the difference between these two? Defined by vegetation, plant selection be used to connect and reinforce, replicate the natural area. Well, one is match and one is replicate. One is reinforcing, so there's a little bit of difference. So it's a replication as opposed to matching and connection and reinforcing. So the replication would be exactly, and the 10 mile would be similar biomic plants. Okay, and we will define that a little bit more. See what animal connections. So if you're within 10 miles of a flyway, you're going to have to create nesting habitats and feeding stopovers. Some kind of feeding, water, and habitat on your site. So if you're in a major byway, there's not too many major byways here. Mississippi, Red River, and maybe some other ones, but they're pretty well defined. So if you're in 10 miles on either side of those flyways, you're going to have to start creating some habitat on that. If you're in 1 mile of existing or planned animal movement corridor, then you're going to have to talk about how you are going to support that, and we'll talk about that a little bit. If you're within 10 miles of a wild management area, we expect some kind of connection there. If the site is 1 mile terrestrial habitat of rare, threatened, or endangered species, if the project's within 1 mile of a habitat of a rare endangered insect or arthropod, and then if it's adjacent to aquatic habitat or rare threatened fish, if the project's within 1 mile of a known bird habitat or nesting of rare, threatened, endangered species, and then if the project's within 10 miles of national refuge. All those things will be required for you to make some kind of connection in some way, whether it's through the plant connections or whether it's through a habitat connection or whether it's through a food connection that habitat would be compatible with. So each one of these will be specific, and I'll get to that. It'll be specific. Then there's human connections. And what here is some, again, bike paths, walking paths, future water trails. How many people knew there were water trails? Yeah, DNR people probably do. Birding trails, and then, so if you're close to that, we would like to make some connection again between those trails. If they're close, or, and again, if they're off your property, it's a matter of working with the local organization there to make sure that you can support that in some way. And that, it's a little nebulous, but at least your project should not be a pediment to any one of these expansions into these trails and stuff like that. So if they're close to you, you should be acknowledged of it. It might even come close to your site or right through your site. Okay, and then a quarter mile for existing transit stop. You can see that that was in the last one, but essentially all these other ones are not in the last one. So again, it requires some circumspection of the site. And here's requirements. So how we determine is listing vegetation selected, demonstrating compliance, including a class fact sheet narrative on the project to native and conservation areas, and list of species selected from the class fact sheet. So each one of these SNAs have a list of material, a list of plant species that they're in that SNA. And so we would expect you to show that and also your plant selection. And then a lot of it is just documenting on the site plan, animal habitat is required, and also human networks, where they are. You might have to show a little regional map. If there's none in the area, then you're scot-free, aren't you? But if there is, then you're going to have to start making those connections. So it's a lot of requirements, but if you aren't 10 miles from a SNA, you're done. And how many SNAs? Do you know how many SNAs there are? Scenic natural areas, scientific. There's about 400 of them in the state of Minnesota. Yeah, there isn't too many in the urban areas, although. Okay, so I want to talk about water quality and efficiency. Site water and then building water. So Again, to restore the natural water cycle. The theme of Peter's and I class that we've been teaching almost 16, 17 years now is restoring the natural water cycle. And first you have to know what the water cycle is, and then you got to work on restoring it. And it's kind of interesting how much we've degraded it throughout the whole Minnesota. If you could only have less than 10% impervious surface on your site, you wouldn't have to do any of this. But there's very few sites that have that. So we have to talk about how we restore that natural water cycle. Is there any questions about why we want to restore the natural water cycle? People understand that the whole degradation of our water quality and our rivers and our sites and soils and things like that are dependent on it. The natural water cycle is here, well, we know, for 10,000 years, right? Because after glaciation, 13,000. And then within the last maybe 75 to 100 years, we decided to change that natural water cycle. Essentially, everything below 3 feet or 5 feet still assumes the natural water cycle is going on. Even though we buried streams, there's water going into those areas that were streams, right? Because the soil conditions and everything else, it's still running like it has run for 10,000 years. So if we can restore some of those things, we can actually get the nature to kind of work for us. So some of the major threats to water quality is nitrates, nitrogen in the runoff, and also road salt. And we'll talk about road salt. And road salt is a new thing that this is coming into this, and we need to address it. But if you're on site, if you're on the top of the watershed, for projects located in uplands, Group A and Group B have to infiltrate almost all their soil, all their water. So why do we want the uplands wet? Because essentially that's where the groundwater comes in, is the uplands, and it will go down. We don't want to wet the lowlands, right? That's called flooding. So we don't allow a lot of the water to come off the uplands. So if in fact you are in the Midlands or lowlands, you're type A or type B, you follow the other ones. But if you just happen to be located on your top of the watershed, we want to make sure you infiltrate. And then for projects in the lowlands, A and B soils, we want you to infiltrate a little bit less. But again, infiltration. And then if you're located in between, then you follow the other one. And then features and site locations, watersheds or lake sheds, or any site watershed features should be shown to inform the design of the site. So we have watersheds as well as lake sheds here, right? And if those lake sheds are impacting your site, we want to know whether they're impacting your site. You should know what watershed you're in and where the water is going. And that is broken down pretty precisely on maps the DNR has. Okay. And then the flood prevention, it's essentially you can't build in the floodplain unless it's essential to the program of projects, and then you have to build, I believe it's 2 feet over the 100-year flood. Usually we wouldn't allow you to do it, but sometimes you have to build in a floodplain. And then the runoff rate. Sites should be designed not to exceed the pre-settlement runoff rate for native soils and vegetation. And you can comply with that using TR55. People aware of TR55? It's a pretty simple calculation. There's a map of it. So essentially, when you have runoff, and you can have runoff in B, C, and D soils, it should run off at the same rate as pre-vegetation. So there's going to be some holding on some D soils, right? You're going to have to hold it somehow. Okay. Outdoor water efficiency. Again, this is a change. No potable water should be used for irrigation after 5 years of plant establishment. So after 5 years, no more irrigation from potable water. You can certainly use roof water. We would expect that a lot of the plant species you plant are pretty drought tolerant. But if you want to have areas that you need to water all the time, some special planting areas, you can use roof water to do that. There's out here, except actual rainfall is, per month is less than 30% of the average. And then potable water can be used again in order to sustain the plants. And then such as athletic fields are exempt. Anything that has a program on it, and it has to be a program that's pretty viable. You can't say, well, we like to walk on this area and look at birds. No, it has to be, an athletic. Then that can use irrigation all the time. Okay, how's it feeling about this? First time we got a lot of pushback on this one. But I think it's doable. I just really think it's doable. And there's no sense in keeping watering plants on and on when you can use either roof collected rainwater or gray water. Yeah. With some treatment. Okay. Indoor water quality, it used to be 30%, it's going up to 50%, less than a baseline established on 1992 Energy Policy Act. So we put that up there. And the criteria can be met using low and flow fixtures, recycled rainwater, and other strategies. So it's just potable water, 50% reduction in potable water. Renovation portions may be limited to criteria, and it will be based on the number of fixtures, and there we'll ask for certain things. Recycled rainwater can be used to offset the percentage of potable water if it's allowed in the jurisdiction. And to verify compliance, it will be the same operation of the building, the sub-metering. So we have that kind of B3 water thing guide right now, so we're just going to 50%. So a little bit more ratcheting that down. Any questions on that mechanical? And then submittals. Submittals requirement for infiltration, evapotranspiration, etc. Upload the complete MIS model, demonstrating intent to remove removal systems required for DSS and phosphorus reductions. You could almost use that for 2A too. I think MIS looks at runoff and all these various. You can design it within MIS to look at what best management practice you can use. And then submit all plant materials that are either drought tolerant or can live without potable water. And then submit a base case indoor water consumption. All right? I think that's it. Any questions more on that? So you can see how we're looking at more network-wide kind of issues than we have before, and looking at information on the site and in the area to support the requirements. So Peter will go on and we'll even go further into this.
I'm Peter McDonough and Kestrel Design Group. So I'm going to take you through three others, which is soils, vegetation, and habitat fauna. And we expect that there's the soil triangle. There's 12 types of textures on there. If you go to the Web Soil Survey, WSS, you can excerpt any site in Minnesota, and it will, and you put an area of interest around it, and then it comes up on the left side. You'll hit the soil series. It'll tell you the soil series. So the soil series are basically like species of soils, and it'll tell you what textures your soils are. It'll give you all of this detail, except if it's in a very urban area and it's a Udorthans or it's Udobsamens. So it's a sandy kind of urban soil, or it's a all mixed in kind of an urban soil. In which case, there's other things that you get directed somewhere else. We're looking for you to then amend those soils if you're planting stuff into it. But if you've got this kind of a system that you fall into, then we want you to work with the WSS, the Web Soil Survey. So a site soil inventory map, and this is for the areas that you're not putting buildings on or you're not putting parking lots on. It's for that area. 8 soil orders. So Minnesota has 8 soil orders, 1,000 soil series. But like I said, if you go to that site, you will get all of that information. So you don't have to send a soil scientist out on site to get it for you. Listing of soil limiting constraints for organic or wetland or expansive soils. So if you're up in the Red River Valley, vertisols, shrink swell. That'll take you into different category. Obviously, wetland soils, we want to know what's going on there in terms of, is that a jurisdictional wetland or not? And organic soils, if there's a very, very high organic matter in there, as an example, 10%. Or histosols have 30%, so they're really gooey. That puts you into another category. 3 stages. So we've come up with this 3 categories of soil, whether it's a natural soil, an agricultural soil, or an urban soil. So if you see that urethance or salmons come up, that's an urban soil. If it's agricultural, it means that if you dug a trench, you'd see an A horizon and a B horizon and a C horizon, but you'd see compaction and other kinds of things in there. And if it's a natural soil, so it hasn't been, it was woodland and then it was cleared off and it was grazed, but it was never plowed, then that will have an O horizon as well and maybe an E horizon too. So that's defined in there. So if you're in each of those, whichever of those categories you're in, we have different guidelines for things that we want you to do. Obviously, if you're on an urban site, you're not going to have nearly the same requirements as if you are on a natural site. And then greenfield. So this is, we're trying to encourage existing sites to be renovated or reused rather than to push out on the edge of the metropolitan area going into greenfields and agricultural areas. So it isn't that you can't do it, but if you do it, you have to have justification for doing it. Listing of specialized Minnesota DNR, defined native plant communities, and that you can pick up. That's on the web. Go to the DNR website, the heritage site, and you can see exactly where they are in relationship to your site. And atypical soils. So that's an unusual situation. So I said a histosol as an example, or a vertisol, then we want you to treat those differently, but you're rarely going to encounter that. So that's just kind of almost an outlier. And then we want you to do some soil testing, but it's it's the soil testing you get at the University of Minnesota Soil Lab. $17 a test, that kind of thing. So we're not asking for something really extensive, but we want you to know what it is you're dealing with. And I said about the greenfield site rationale, if you have to be on a greenfield, these are the things that we are requiring for you to do. Limit soil disturbance. So these are from landscape practices, landscape architecture practices. So these are not new, but we want to put it in this so that it becomes part of this guideline. So 40 feet beyond the building perimeter. So again, all of you have seen some of these trucks have some kind of magnetic attraction to green fields, so they just keep driving out onto green areas. We want to eliminate that. So we want to put the boundaries on that and enforce it. So we've got distance from buildings, from roads, from walkways, and from trees. Stormwater management areas, obviously an infiltration area. And I'm sure you don't want trucks going across there. Then we have bulk density limits. Again, this only refers to the places where there's going to be things planted. So if it's a clay and a silt, bulk density limits of 1.25 grams per cubic centimeter. And this doesn't need to be done until you're right at the end of your project. So just, if you have enough organic matter in here, you're going to be just fine with these. And the organic matter threshold we set for these all soils is 3.5%. So if you're at that, you're probably not going to have any issue meeting these bulk density. A delineated wetland boundary, so a watershed buffer, pretty simple. This is one that's been in there before, but we want to just again bring your attention to it is that when you're done, the areas that are going to have plantings on them, except a green roof, or there's some other structural reason for it, needs to have a 12-inch deep topsoil respread. Not a 4-inch, not a 6-inch, not an 8-inch, a 12-inch. And we want that confirmed before soil is sold off a site. Okay. Pretty wide range on pH, 4.5 to 8.5. And pH, I covered that one already in the Organic, or for urban soil requirements, same on the organic matter. And you can use, if it's Class A biosolids, that's just fine with us. Something cheap like that, wood chips, cheap compost. What we're looking for is we're looking for the organic matter incorporated in there. We're not looking for a specific kind of compost. If it is a compost, we just require that it meets the compost guidelines, the U.S. Council of Compost Guidelines, which is basically there's no weed seeds in it. Pre-development, if there's a compaction layer, we want you to rip it and we want you to incorporate organic matter into it. If they went and they ran across it a bunch of times, then we want you to take it down to 12 inches. If it was farmed, we want it down to 24 inches. And minor modifications, so you can call out areas where it's just a top dressing on the top. Soils modified to achieve the following NRCS infiltration rate, and Rich took you through that. Natural is a group A, agricultural is group B, C, urban soils, and group D, obviously, you're not going to be infiltrating in that. Cation exchange capacity of at least 15. Again, that comes on that cheap soil test. It'll tell you what that is, and essentially it's the ability of the soil to move nutrients around in it. And a 0 is a kaolinite. Organic, straight up organic matter soil is 400, so 15 isn't that much, it's just, but we don't want it below that. Base saturation, at least 30% should be achieved. So if we're looking for the soil to have that level of performance in it, and if it has the 15, it's probably got the base saturation of 15 as well. And we want to have incorporation of mycorrhizae. Again, this is for an urban soil. This is not, if you're inheriting a good soil, you don't need to follow any of these guidelines. Atypical, this, because it's a rare thing that you're going to encounter, it's only if if you find an area where it's going to be planted, it's over 5,000 square feet in area, that these guides would apply, that don't apply the 12-inch topsoil respread, etc. Again, so the Minnesota Biological Survey, if it calls out that there's an S1 or an S2, then you're going to have to look and find that, investigate it on site, and fence it off. Here's the submittal requirements. Description of site soils per the guidelines, so we want you to include in your package. I went to the web soil survey, I got this. I looked at the natural areas that were nearby. That package of stuff includes these things. So submit site plan delineating the limits of the soil disturbance for the development of the project. Construction documents section with specifications for both density requirements for unpaved pervious areas. So these are areas, again, that are going to be planted in some way or another. Wetlands are present. Submit the site planting noting the 50-foot vegetated buffer. Submit contract documents which prohibits the selling or exporting of topsoil if it's less than 12 inches. If you have 18 inches of topsoil and the contractor wants to sell 6 inches, that's okay. But the 12 inches is the standard we're looking for. And 3.5 matter. So we want you to think about in the urban soil restoration in units of about 1,000 square feet areas. This is what I'm doing here, here, and here, and they're all the same. So then I'm covered on this. Submit results of coordination with the Minnesota Biological Soils or Biological Survey for natural plant community restoration, and that's within that 1 mile area. So that doesn't cover, that's not everything. And when we talk about the native, like a scientific and natural area, we're not looking for you to get all of the species. If there's orchids on that site, we don't expect you to have orchids on your site. So if a 0 is a buckthorn and a 10 is a lady slipper, we're looking for stuff that you're going to be doing in the 1s, 2s, and 3s in terms of coefficients of conservancy. So not extremes that we're asking for. We're basically asking for the base species that would show up, like big blue stem, little blue stem, the bulrushes, etc. Vegetation, this is just for information. We 5% loss in the boreal areas, 40 to 60 in the deciduous forests, and 90% in the prairies. And so if you're in the prairie area, we were wanting you to try and incorporate prairie biome function on your site. Again, avoidance of critical sites, prime farmland of state significance, and that you can get that right off of the web soil survey. It'll tell you. Former municipal township or county parkland. We want to avoid taking parks out of commission to turn into development. Formerly federally protected land and areas covered by conservation easement. So there's a chart which basically you can look it up and say, okay, for me to get this is how many trees I'm going to need. So, and then we list off for soil volumes this really applies mostly to urban areas. Small trees, 400, medium trees, 800, and large trees, 1,200 cubic feet per tree. If you're going to use structural soil, that's fine, but your numbers are going to increase dramatically because that is at a 5-to-1 rate. You're going to have to need 5 times those numbers up there if you're using structural soil. So it's easier to just use regular soil. Diversity. So we're not looking at species diversity, we're looking at genera diversity. So if you have 5 different kinds of maples on a site, fewer than 2 acres, that's really not what we're looking for. We're looking for you to have some maples, some oaks, some hackberry or hickories or whatever it is that else you want. 5 genera on sites of 2 to 5 acres, and any genera, whether it's evergreens or broadleaf deciduous, as long as you have these kinds of numbers. And that only applies, no, sorry, I contradict myself, I won't do that. So, any case, here's the tree planting requirements, pretty standard. But it's based on the research, and yeah, I don't think there's a lot to say about that. Some irrigation requirements, and again, you have a 5-year window for establishment. And these are just more of those pretty detailed specifications we want you to incorporate into your specification package. And then if you're doing one of these plant communities, you can go to the Native Seed Mix Design for Roadsides, go to that website, and it will tell you what you can do. If I want a prairie, I want a mesic prairie, it'll tell you what that is. And it won't say you need 3 pen sedge and 7 of this. It'll say if you use any of these 4 sedge types, or if you use any of these 3 grass types, or any of these 9 forb types, you're okay, because we understand that you don't want to be chasing the last 3 ounces of seed in the state or something like that, the cost that goes with that. So it's meant to have a market sense to it. And here's the various stratas. Keystone species. So we're just asking when you're in these plant communities, hardwood to southeastern savanna, south and southeastern hardwood deciduous, that there be at least some bur oak. If you're a prairie savanna, that there be some hazelnut on site. The prairie tall aspen parkland, there be in a dry area Cytodes grama, or a big blue stem and Indian grass, hydric switchgrass, and prairie cordgrass. So just that some of those are showing up there as keystone species. And then I talked a little bit earlier about the coefficiency of conservancy, and that's what the floristic quality assessment is about. This really only happens in places where you're bumped up against a river or a stream, and we want you to look at what's there before that gets changed dramatically. This one is going to be more of a challenge. This is neonic-free sites. This is the goal. The goal is that we want to make neonic-free sites, and the way that you determine that is through the chain of custody. this comes directly from the state. So this was, the legislature said, we want to make sure this happens. The same way as the bird safe is from the state, as is the pollinators. So that's where this driver comes from. Site planting should be selected so that at least 50% by quantity of trees, shrubs, ground covers, vines, and herbaceous perennials are insect pollinated or rich in pollen or nectar. This is again, this is how we're interpreting what this come from the legislature. 3 seasons of bloom, pretty simple. If you can, put all your pollinator stuff in one big group. Rich talked about it earlier. The bigger the area, the better. We'd prefer to have one bigger area rather than 10 little areas in terms of impact, habitat, and less, the closer to round and the less strung out like a noodle it is, the better in terms of habitat integrity. And then we would like you to use natural structure enhancements for these pollinators. Pretty simple. They're cheap. Cultivars with double and triple petals, so we want you to have, so a dahlia doesn't have any pollen benefits to it because basically all of the nectar pollen stuff has been excerpted out of there. So we want you to look for stuff that's closer to the species than something that is very, very much a very refined cultivar. Biomass targets, again, we have a chart for that so that you won't have to figure that out 6 years in. Site albedo. Yeah.
We looked at Urban Heat Island, and so what we've done is we've just, the entire site, as a site, buildings, plant materials, parking lots, grass, or planting areas, cannot have to be at least 2.5 albedo for the entire site. So you can design your site however you want. You don't have to go with a white roof if you don't want, or whatever, but the entire site. And this is in July 1st at noon, the sun coming down, so you're looking at that temperatures. So we're not saying exactly what to do. We're just saying figure it out, how your albedo on your site is. Everybody understand what albedo reflection? So the selection of materials here have big impact, right? Is that, so we're not prescribing anything, we're just saying here's a performance metric, and then you'll just have to have you have to supply a map that shows all the albedos, and then the average, prorating it throughout the site to meet, 2.5, right, or less.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah. So here's the list of submittals. So this shows all of the counties that have been mapped for the for rare, threatened, and endangered species, and also for intact ecosystems. Used to be called a county biological survey. So the big maps, the colors, the bright colors are the ones where there's an intact plant community, as determined by the DNR. So protection of rare, threatened, or endangered species. So again, if you're near one of these scientific and natural areas, or a plant community that has been called out on the biological survey as of importance, we want you to not put a connection between your site and this site, but support it in terms of the species that are here versus the species that are over there. And these are just characteristics of, we want some kind of water on site, open year round, and it's a very small amount, okay? It's a very small amount, and it's shallow, okay? So we're not talking anything like this room. When you get up in acreage, then it gets bigger. But the bottom one is incorrect. That will be 5%, not 15%. And then the perimeter with gently sloped or size of features under 2 inches depth. So some shallow, a lot of shallow. Maximum depth of feature in inches. So again, we're talking very, very modest. animal habitat, so this is the structural stuff. Bat boxes, we would like those included. When your site is above 3 acres in size, we want you to incorporate bat habitat in there. Right now, bat populations are going like this. So we want to at least set the table so that they roost in bigger groups together, and more of those are eliminated. So we want to try and get more places in the landscape for them to hang out, roost, eat, etc. There's some more of the structures, pretty simple. Okay, dark sky. Do you want to touch that, Rich?
So dark sky, we're just going with the Dark Sky Association, and there's 3 different kind of limitation, or 3 different kind of ordinances for kind of urban areas, suburban areas, and rural areas. And again, it's going to be lumens per site. You'll have so much lumens to put on your site, and you can put it anywhere you want. There'll be 10,000 lumens that you can put on your site. And then you figure out whether you want to put it in parking lot or you want to put it on special areas or whatever. So again, the metric is going to be lumens. And then you just have to show a map where the lumens are.
So that brings to that concludes our presentation, and now we're questions part.